I would like to persuade you by the time we finish this evening that you are all philanthropists and that you are all social entrepreneurs and that all social entrepreneurs are entrepreneurs. Okay? And refuseniks, and there will be some, we can keep talking for the rest of the term because I won't give up on trying to persuade you. So let me start with a few housekeeping details. What we're going to do this evening is I'm going to talk for about half an hour about what I think philanthropy and social entrepreneurship are and why I think they're important in the context of your lives, courses, and careers. I'm then going to have a conversation with my friend and colleague, Professor Nava Ashraf, who is sitting over there. It's quite possible that Nava will want to disagree with me at some time before the half an hour is up, in which case you'll see Professor Ashraf there leap up and tell me why I'm wrong. If she can contain herself, she'll tell me why I'm wrong when we're both together up here. And then we're going to open the floor for you to ask us questions or tell us why we're wrong. You will already know, I suspect, how the Marshall Institute lectures work. There are 6 of them. And if you attend 5 out of those 6, you will get a certificate saying you've attended the Marshall Institute lectures. And the reason we've done that is because we would like you to get some credit for your commitment to improving the state of the world and understanding some, not all, but some of the mechanisms by which some of that stuff happens. The lecture series looks like this. It runs between now and the end of January. I will attempt to create a running thread through the lecture series, so I will remind you each time what we talked about last time, and I will try to tee up what we will talk about this time. And what you'll see is that there's a kind of an arc across the series from definition to money, or from definition to institutional reality. And I hope that that arc will become more and more apparent as we go along. And along the way, I want you to think about how this stuff relates to your own experience in your own lives, not just so that you have the killer question when I come to say, and who has a question, but because I think this is important stuff. And I'd like to begin by saying a couple of things that I suspect you may not agree with. Cash exceeds opportunity. Anyone want to disagree yet? By the way, it's absolutely fine to disagree. Put your hand up and say, no, I don't agree. Cash exceeds opportunity. So most of the problems that we think hardest about, the problems we consider to be most intractable, poverty, injustice, you name it, okay, present as resource problems. And of course they are resource problems, but they are not categorically and fundamentally resource problems in the sense that cash exceeds opportunity. Okay? It's a very, very difficult thing to grasp if you are trying to raise money, or if you see instances all the time of people having too little. Okay? So one thought experiment is, imagine you had the theoretically perfect answer to something, and all it would require was $1 trillion. Okay? But you knew, you had insight such that you could guarantee metaphysically that it would solve that particular problem. Okay? Would that money be forthcoming or would it not? Okay? The answer is, of course it would. Okay? Provided you are pushing the logic of this such that you'd have to be able to demonstrate that that was true. Okay? So keep in your heads the notion that cash exceeds opportunity. And then keep in your heads the idea that some things really are scarce, much scarcer than cash. Innovation, ingenuity, independence, creativity. These are rare and scarce things which we should cherish when we find them, and we should work very, very hard to develop them. And then there's a category of thing that is very widely distributed and entirely renewable. Okay? It is a genuinely renewable resource. Okay? And you will have different languages for this, depending on your tradition and depending on your intellectual formation and your history. Okay? But I would call those genuinely renewable things like generosity, or empathy, or altruism, or goodwill, or humaneness. Okay? These things are abundant, widely distributed, no respecter of circumstance. Okay? So in the backs of your minds, hold these three things. Okay? It's really hard to develop mechanisms for being better at innovation and creativity. Okay? It's really easy to harness your own notions of fellow feeling and generosity. Okay? And cash, although critically important to the development of ventures, is rarely the single most constraining feature. Okay? Those three things, quite important, at least in my view. Does anyone want to disagree profoundly yet? Okay. Let me start with some very basic definitions. Okay. The first written Old English reference to philanthropy, as far as I'm aware, and the co-founder of the Marshall Institute, who has a Mac on, is sitting there, will tell me if I've got this wrong, comes from a catalogue of plants and simply describes a plant that sticks to humans and then gets carried around so the seeds get efficiently spread. You've all had them stuck to your trousers, I'm sure, at some point. Okay? It then moves through a series of definitions until it starts to look more and more like the kind of thing you think it is. Okay? Something to do with a love of humanity, something to do with organized generosity, something to do with voluntary action for public good. And you will all know, I hope, that the Marshall Institute's mission, the Marshall Institute's tagline is private action for public benefit. And you'll see where that definition came from. I would like to add, in the context of these lectures, another definition for you, which is it's also about what you choose to do with your lives. Okay? Even those of you who've got debt, who's got debt? Hands up. Okay, that's better than a smattering, okay? So most of you who've got cash debt, okay? But most of you are not aware that when you make decisions about where you study, and what you do after you study, that's an act of generosity. That's an act of attribution of your creativity, your time, your energy, your background, your prestige, your good fortune, your whatever it is that you count as your capital. That's an act of allocating that capital to something. Okay? And it's a choice. Okay? It sometimes doesn't feel like a choice. Sometimes it feels like a race. Sometimes it feels like I better get hired because otherwise my debt will just escalate. Or I better get hired because I promised my parents I'd get hired. Or I better get hired, whatever the reason. Okay? Thinking consciously about allocating your own resource, yourself as resource, okay, is a form of this. Okay? So I want you to hold in your minds this notion of what I think philanthropy is. Okay? And then I want you to think or turn your attention to entrepreneurship. Okay? There are lots and lots and lots and lots of definitions of entrepreneurship, and most of them are more or less around the notion that it's about starting something. It's about creating something that didn't exist before. Okay? It's about finding a new way of creating a margin for yourself. Okay? The best definition, the most standard definition. How many of you have seen this one before? Okay, if you do entrepreneurship classes, typically you will come across this. And what this means is that what entrepreneurs do is they cause things to happen without owning the means to cause them to happen. Okay, you can start something without your own money, without any staff, without any clients, without any customers, without any IP, without a prototype, without any contracts, without a building, without whatever it is you think you need in order to get stuff done. And that's the remarkable thing about entrepreneurs, is that they can bridge between a story about the future and a reality about the present. Okay? They can get stuff done on the basis of argument, on the basis of trust, on the basis of stitching together a kind of network of things that they neither own nor control. That's the critical thing. Okay? And those of you who've tried to start an organization, doesn't matter whether it's a company or a charity or a department or a program or a micro venture, doesn't matter what it is, what you find is you suddenly have to imagine, how do you go from this thing that you can see in the future that has no tangible reality, okay, but you want to make it real? Well, then you go talk to people, typically is what happens, and you say, well, you've got the money and you've got the building and you've got the lorry and, you know, etc. Okay? So think of this as a useful working definition of entrepreneurship. And then imagine what it looks like when applied to public benefit. Okay? And again, you will find the world of social entrepreneurship is absolutely riven with definitional disagreement. Okay? 100 social entrepreneurs will give you 100 different definitions, and the spectrum is pretty wide. Okay? You will find people arguing fiercely that social entrepreneurship cannot possibly be for profit. Okay? Because the profit motive, competition, the idea of capturing markets rather than sharing markets, the idea of risk-adjusted return for shareholders, the idea of any margin between the thing you're selling and the cost of it to the person you're selling it to, that stuff is anathema. And what you might want to say is that's the activist wing of social entrepreneurship. Okay? Those are people who take entrepreneurial principles. They get stuff done without owning and controlling the means of getting them done, and they get them done to change minds. Okay? And it's not a money thing at all. And at the other end of that spectrum, there are people who believe that social entrepreneurship is social entrepreneurship by virtue of the genius of capitalist incentives, market disciplines. Okay? You know, the simple rigor of having to report in a particular way. Okay? The notion that you can take capital, private capital, okay, put it at risk, return to the owner of that capital in respect of the risk, and still get amazing things done, is fundamental to their definition. And between that spectrum, there is every flavor of definition. Okay? My view is that we've spent in the 20-ish years that social entrepreneurship has been mainstream, we spent too long on the theology, okay, and not enough on some of the other things which I'll go on to talk about. I don't greatly mind if your enterprise is not for profit, provided it's not for profit on purpose. It's not so good if you're not for profit by accident. I don't greatly mind if your initiative is one for activists. Okay? If there are no shareholders, if what you want to do is mobilize the greatest possible number of people out on the streets, on the barricades, if that's your thing, that's fine. Okay? I think about it as getting stuff done without owning the means, or controlling the means to get it done. And what I also think is it has to have a very high degree of intentionality. Okay? I don't believe you can be a social entrepreneur by accident. Okay? I think you can, I imagine, Tom will tell me if this is wrong, you think you can be a philanthropist by accident. I think you could imagine being an accidental philanthropist. You can't imagine being an accidental entrepreneur. First of all, it's too hard. And second, for it to have intentional social return, okay, that has to be front and center. So that's some very basic definitional stuff. Okay. If this were each of these things that we've just spent, 3 minutes on, is a term at least, okay, a year at least, or a lifetime at least. So you're getting a very, very, very stylized version of this. And what I'm trying to tee up goes as follows. This evening's election result notwithstanding, the world is a complicated and scary place. Okay? You will have your own list of things that you think is wrong with the world. Okay? But we already know that there is serious problems of water, inundation or drought, of forced migration, of energy insecurity, of food insecurity, okay, and so on, okay, of pandemic. Okay. You will have, depending on where you care about, who you care about, and what you know about, a register of things which have, by virtue of globalization, become systemic, okay, and correlated. Okay, and that's important, okay, because pre-globalization, very, very, very bad things could happen somewhere, but if you were lucky enough not to be there, they weren't going to happen where you were. So we live in a world in which these so-called existential threats are serious and gathering. Okay, you with me? Everyone happy with that as a diagnosis? Anyone want to say no? Okay, that's thing one. Thing two, we live in a world in which we know more than we have ever known before. We live in a world of bioengineering and 3D printing and quantum computing and personalized medicine and the kind of behavioral sciences that you will hear about in a minute from Professor Ashraf, the kinds of things that you know about and learn about every day in your classes here. Okay, so we know a lot, and we are more connected, and the barriers for innovation are coming down and down and down. Okay, in order to write the code that changes the nature of a particular kind of practice, you don't any longer need to be in San Jose or in MIT. Okay, theoretically, you could be anywhere. So, global, existential, horrible, scary, amazing, science-based knowledge production over here. So what therefore, is the next step in this conversation? What's the unifying position? Or at least what's the hopeful position? The hopeful position is you. Okay. Remember, trust me when I say that cash exceeds opportunity, okay? So just put that aside for the time being. What's needed is people who are prepared to commit their private capital, that is their personal capital, their reputation, their ideas, their energy, their creativity, their education, their background, their friends, their networks, all of that, to making something out of that scary positive. Okay? So one way to frame this conversation is to say there has never been a better time in history to be an entrepreneur. You have never had greater access to expertise, financial capital, or each other in the history of humankind, ever. Okay? So why would anybody not wish to embrace that challenge? And in particular, why would anybody not, in an institution like this, and remember, you're all in an institution dedicated to making the world better by thinking hard about its hardest problems. That's why you're here. Okay? That's why the Marshall Institute exists here and not somewhere else. That's why you are in debt, those of you who had your hands up. Okay? So why would your own act of philanthropy, which is to say, what am I going to spend myself on over the next 80,000 hours? Does anyone know 80,000 hours? Yeah. Okay, there you go. How will I spend my 80,000 hours? That's you as philanthropists. How will I create something out of nothing? How will I be sensitive to the most pressing problems? Okay? Whether they're great, big, scary, existential global threats, or whether they're local, particular, community-bound, operational things that you can fix by being there. How will we do that? Okay? And what do we need in order to do it? Okay? We need a bunch of things, okay, that are really, really important, okay, and that I think are scarce. You know that I don't think cash is the problem, okay, and we will come on to talk in the series as it develops. We will come on to talk about the Gates and the big foundations and the Zuckerbergs and so on and so on, but cash is not the problem. Human generosity is not the problem. Where the problems are is in analytical deficit, in the absence of evidence, in the really hard work required for people to understand the people on whose behalf we think we speak. Okay, that's where the hard stuff is. But again, the good news is that that's what you do every day. That's why you're at the LSE. You're at the LSE in order to understand more about hard stuff. You're there in order to develop analytical, conceptual, critical, statistical insights. And without those, the matching of the cash and the human generosity and the existential threat. Okay? And remember, existential threats feel existential even if they're local. Okay. It doesn't matter to the person who's being flooded or forced to move whether their particular risk is correlated. Okay. So that's my message, and that's the Marshall Institute message. You're in a remarkable place. You're in one of the world's truly great institutions. Because you're in this room, you are touching an institute inside the LSE that cares deeply about using creativity, energy, science to make a positive difference. Okay? But we can't announce this in a press release and say henceforth all social problems will be solved because we're clever. Okay? I wish we could, but as you know, well know, we can't, and nor can even very, very, very big organizations. So it's about you, okay? And I think we're going to hear in a minute who else it's about, but it is critically about you. So I wanted you to have a sense of this lecture series, not just as giving you practical insight into how people make decisions, how people fund certain things, what philosophers say about trade-offs between doing good for many people and doing good for fewer people, what people who've had experience of having their hands on some of the longest levers of power in the world, what they all have to say. That's important and it's interesting and you will benefit from it. What I really want from you is to engage with this notion that you are yourselves philanthropists, because it's you you're voting your 80,000 hours with. And I would like you to think that entrepreneurship is not something that happens elsewhere. It's not something that people with beards called Branson do. Okay? It's something that all of us do and all of us can do in our daily exchanges with humans and generosity and money and all of that stuff. And it needs science and analysis. So at the risk of crowning failure, tell me now how many of you think you are philanthropists? Few. It's gone up, but not by many. Oh, it's gone up by, it's gone up by a few. Tell me how many of you are entrepreneurs on this model. It's gone up, not enough. But look, anyone with a certificate is going to have their hand up by the end of this series. What I'm going to do next is to ask my friend and colleague, Professor Nava Ashraf, to come join me on one of these chairs. And I'm going to ask her 2 or 3 questions on your behalf, and then I'm going to suggest you ask us questions. Okay? At 8 o'clock sharp, we will adjourn and go to the atrium next door for drinks. You're all very welcome to that. Nava, welcome. I didn't quite give Nava her due when I told her that she might disagree with me before invited to. So let me just embarrass her very quickly before we start. Nava comes to the LSE from Harvard Business School. Nava has an extraordinary reputation as the generator of some really great work in behavioral economics. Nava lives what she argues and does real field experimentation. We are enormously fortunate to have her at the Marshall Institute and at the LSE, and I'm enormously fortunate to have her as a colleague. So that's the proper welcome. Welcome.
Oh, that's...
Can I ask you a very simple question to start with?
Can I just say that I never thought of myself as a philanthropist until this moment, so thank you for the framing that you just gave all of us. That was amazing.
Do you really think that when we speak for people or problems, we being large organizations, small organizations, charities, foundations, investors, do you think we understand enough about the beneficiary in that system?
I mean, absolutely not. I think the challenge, the thing is, like, maybe you're all feeling it too, you know. I was there feeling like, yes, I'm a philanthropist, yes, I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm going to solve the world's problems. And I think that, exactly that enthusiasm can blind us, because we want to give things to people. And that's a beautiful instinct, right? To have the desire within you to give and to serve and to put all that you have inside of you at the heart of what you can give to your fellow human beings. But that in itself can be blinding, because we think that we are giving things to people. And we can miss the fact that we're not giving outcomes to people. We're not, I mean, you have a health project, you're not giving health to people. You have a school, you're not giving education to people. You could put a school up, but you're not actually giving people education. People are producing education, their own education. They're producing their own health. So the challenge, I think, with philanthropy and social entrepreneurship is that people get enamored with what they are providing without really understanding who's at the other side, and that person is actually producing their own health, education, development, whatever it is. And that requires a whole shift in the way we understand what we might call the beneficiary, or the end user, or the co-producer of these outcomes.
So this is one of the areas, famously, where markets are always shown to be good at this. If you buy a phone and it doesn't work, you stop buying that particular phone. The signal between you and the phone maker is pretty direct. Is this one of the areas where the promise of certain kinds of philanthropy or certain kinds of social entrepreneurship that are more market-oriented, is that where they get their impulse?
So the exact question is, how do we find out about the beneficiary, and how do they have a voice? Markets provide a voice through price and purchase, right? That's a voice for the beneficiary to be able to. So if on the other hand, we don't have that mechanism, it's actually quite hard to hear the voice of the beneficiary. And for that reason, I would say that the responsibility of measurement of impact, for example, is enormous. Partly because we don't have these other feedback mechanisms that the market will provide in other circumstances.
How do we, so in the absence of markets, where markets have failed,
Yeah.
okay, where there is no simple relationship between the user, the beneficiary, and the supplier of services, what do we do? How do we find out more about how you create solutions?
Let me also just answer the last thing you said, which is, are there, when you think about the spectrum of philanthropy and social entrepreneurship, is there some version of that is better able to understand the beneficiary? And I would put forward that some of the things that use market mechanisms, like, for example, social marketing, because they have some emphasis on price and transaction with the beneficiary, sometimes are better at understanding the needs of the beneficiary because they have some of that market discipline. And so social entrepreneurship, to some degree, I think, has potentially could have a better shot if they are able to use these mechanisms. Now, in absence of these mechanisms, it's really quite difficult, actually, to think about the end user. And I guess I would say that a lot of what the innovations that have been happening in other fields about human-centered design, for example, and my own field of behavioral economics, that allows us to get inside of the head and heart of the end user, of the co-producer. That gives us behavioral economics, in my experience, gives us a framework for understanding what might be driving the motivations in the decision-making.
Can you give, for those who are not completely familiar with the revolution that behavioral was in addition to economics, just a kind of quick sense of what you believe that means?
So we're at the London School of Economics, and I think, if you think about the kind of extraordinary success that economics as a profession, as a social science has had, a lot of it has been because of simplifying assumptions that have allowed for tractable models that make predictions. That required a simplification of what motivates us and how rational and perfectly kind of utility maximizing we are. That was useful, but wrong, turns out. And although I think there was always a sense that it was wrong, Adam Smith certainly talked a lot about the other things that motivate us, including the principle in our nature that makes us care for others. But it took people from within the profession to come up with the kind of credible evidence that we, as a decision-making entity, each of us, are driven by things other than money, very clearly willing to give up money for all kinds of other types of social factors, that we don't always make the perfectly rational decision, that the preferences that we reveal through our actions are not always our truest, deepest preferences. Those are sacrosanct assumptions within economics that over the last 15 to 20 years have been fundamentally questioned from within the profession itself and allowed for a wide opening to bring in factors of greater description of reality, the deep psychological, cultural, spiritual, emotional factors that drive us as human beings are slowly being incorporated into tractable models, which have the same features of disciplined thinking that economics provide us, but are ultimately just more realistic about how humans actually make decisions and what truly motivates us. And therefore, by understanding this, we're able to get over this problem that we have not only in philanthropy and in social entrepreneurship, but I would say in all of foreign aid and development, which is enormous amount of resources. This is to your point about cash exceeding opportunity. I mean, all of you know the stories of totally inappropriate interventions, programs in every country in the world that don't understand what people really might need and what might be most helpful to them.
Because they're spoken for, not least.
Absolutely.
So I understand, I think everybody understands your very clear explanation of how behavioral economics, as it were, was born and why it's important. How specifically do you think it has promise when we're worrying about questions of resource distribution or social justice or inequality or poverty or disease or whatever it might be?
Yeah, I think, there's in every type of program, product, policy, there is a design choice that is made. We everywhere have an architecture that determines our choices. And we can design those to be better capable of leading people to the decisions and the preferences that they might like, or worse. So just to give you an example, if the real question is how do we help people that are resource constrained save more? They say they want to save more, but they're not able to. What are the types of products and services that we could offer? So this is a great example of, is it just a resource constraint? Or by designing products innovatively that get at what people might really need, you could actually increase savings even given the same kinds of resources. So this is something we did in the Philippines, where we used the insight that there's a challenge with self-control in terms of saving and putting the future in front of the present, that allowed us to design a commitment savings product with a bank in the Philippines that led to a 300% increase in savings at the same interest rate as just a regular savings account. So this is just a small design feature that better understands human nature, that allows us to reach our goals better. So, I mean, the more boring way to put it is that it's more cost effective. The best way to put it is, I think, shameful for us to put resources into anything if we don't really understand what the beneficiary might need.
And that's why cash is not enough and compassion is not enough.
Yes.
And compassion-based movements, okay, obviously philanthropy, but all kinds of compassion-based movements have for a very long time presumed that the compassion piece justifies a set of activities, okay, and the kind of work that Nava and others do suggests that that's nowhere near enough, and that's why this piece about you as the agents of analytical research, evidence-based work is so important if we're to move these things forward. Can I ask you about a kind of fetish object in this world, which is impact? Okay. Impact is something that any one of you who's worked in this world, who's studied this, will know is a very key issue. And people think, well, if only we could measure impact, everything would be okay. Can you give us your sense of what that might mean and what the problems are around the question?
Yeah. Let me start from somewhere else, which is, because I don't want to start with the word impact. It's a very loaded word. I want to start with the concept of how we learn about what we're doing and the effect it's having. How do we learn to optimize our effect? How do we learn as human beings, as organizations? And I mean, to go back to first to think about getting inside the head and the heart of the end user, and using behavioral economics for that. The flip side of behavioral economics, and a big part of why it was able to even make traction within economics and now within development policy, the World Bank World Development Report last year was entirely on behavioral economics. That's a massive shift from the World Bank sort of pushing out policies the same everywhere. It was through experimentation. So experimentation was what allowed people to start developing evidence and data that was different from what their beliefs and priors were and assumptions were. So I guess the first thing I would say is there is no way that we can begin to understand the assumptions that are driving our behavior and how wrong they might be unless we adopt an attitude and an orientation of experimentation and learning. That is how we find, I believe, the humility to be open to learning about what is the best thing, the best way in which we can serve. So then we think, okay, experimentation, that looks like kind of innovation, learning, there's lots of ways to learn. And certainly you can think about, rapid prototyping and iteration, which entrepreneurship uses. And I think basically what we're just talking about is getting deeper and deeper into understanding what is the motto of LSE, which is the causes of things, right? So we can start to do rapid prototyping, we're learning, we're experimenting, but ultimately if we really want to understand the impact of what we're doing, the causal impact of what we're doing, we need to understand the causes of things. And that requires a causal inference process. It also requires the right measurement. So those are two different things, and I think those are often confused when we talk about impact. So when we talk about impact, so now we're going to really talk about impact, which is just, when people talk about impact, they're talking about getting the right measures and getting kind of a comprehensive set of measures. And they're talking about making a causal inference about whether you had the impact on those measures, right? And so on the measures side, I think there's been a lot of innovation of how we measure things. That one of the biggest, I think, pushbacks against impact evaluation is that you can't measure the most important stuff, right? That, the kind of effects and the spillovers and the kind of effects that that an NGO knows it's having are very difficult to actually measure. But actually, there's been enormous innovation on that. So a lot of things that you might think are kind of immeasurable, actually we've done a lot to get closer to that. And then on the other side, it's how do I know that my intervention has had the impact? This sort of causal inference process. And there I would say, I'm not, despite my decades-long affiliation with the Poverty Action Lab, I'm not what you might call a randomista in the sense that I don't think you should only use randomized evaluations, but certainly randomized evaluations are probably the best way for us to understand the causal inference. But there's lots of ways to get closer and closer to understanding the causal inference. And if an organization feels they can't do randomization, they shouldn't make the best an enemy of the good.
So let's move to the other end of the philanthropic scale and away from everyone in the room allocating their personal capital and think about what most people mostly think about, which is large pools of philanthropic capital seeking to have a large impact on very big questions, whether it's malaria or infant mortality or generally whatever it might be. One of the things that has clearly happened over the last 2 decades or so is the shift in the thinking behind those large pools of capital from straight grant making to more investment-like thesis. Okay? And what this means essentially is that people have started saying, well, just as an investor would put their capital at risk and seek a particular set of outcomes and returns, why wouldn't we as major philanthropists have the same philosophy? And this comes under various names, okay, which get kind of merged. Blended finance, impact investing, social finance, venture philanthropy, strategic philanthropy. You'll all have heard one or more of those terms, and they all roughly point in the direction of large amounts of philanthropic capital being managed in a more with greater risk appetite and with more commercial-like thinking. Does that speak for or against some of the things you've just been saying about measurement, impact, humility?
Only to the it speaks for it only to the extent that the measures are good. If the measures are bad, it's actually worse, I would say. If you're going to try to move capital in a direction where the returns are not measured properly, the social returns are not measured well, then actually it could be even more distortionary than the system we have right now. So, and the challenge, I think, in this whole space is that although there has been a tremendous amount of innovation in how to measure social impact well in, for example, development economics, that has not transferred over. There's not a lot of dialogue between that field and the field of like impact investing and social returns. And so if you look hard at the metrics that are being used in the social returns, it's actually something that doesn't really hold up often. And so, I mean, I think one of the most important roles you all can play is to have the critical lens, to look at the metrics and say, you know, to what extent is this actually correct? Because yeah, having an incorrect metric and then, you know, putting everyone's attention there could actually be very problematic. I would even prefer, you know, some qualitative sense on the ground than to have the wrong metrics. But that's something we can talk about.
So I'm, as you may have noticed, I'm now speaking against myself. I'm speaking against what I was saying earlier on. But very interesting and worth looking online for is the head of the Ford Foundation, Darren Walker, has over the last year or so been giving a succession of speeches, essentially berating the people whom Ford has given grants to for becoming too expert in grant seeking, too expert in speaking the language of large foundation grant approval application process, okay? Particularly, in his view, the language of impact. So what Walker is saying is, look, these are very big, difficult problems, okay? Most of which we don't fully understand. And we have got ourselves into this fiction in which we pretend that we know what you're going to do with our money, and you pretend that you know what you're going to do with our money, such that we give you more money. And that this has become a circular conversation that is precisely not of any interest or created by or with the people on whom we claim to speak. That wasn't a question. The question's coming now. So I'm also going to speak against myself by saying that there is also a problem with the kind of entrepreneurial narrative. Okay? The notion that we derive, as it were, from heroic entrepreneurship, particularly technology entrepreneurship, where clever people with enough coding genius and cash can essentially make us all sleep well at night because everything will be fine. And that this has a darker side in the world that we care about. And I wondered if you wanted to speak to that.
Yes, because I think actually that same pitfall that befalls entrepreneurs and that befalls us as a society to think that technology is the answer is the same thing the vulnerability that we have as quote unquote academic experts. What are you getting here except for academic expertise? And that has its own tyranny. And so I think the hard part is to say, okay, we're going to use the science, we're going to use the technology, but we are off our pedestals as experts. And we're on the ground, and we're figuring out what works in the most humble way possible with the people who are co-producing outcomes with us.
I couldn't agree more. In a minute, I'm going to open questions to the floor. While you're thinking of your perfect question, I'm going to ask Nava one more. But when it comes to it, just put your hand up, tell us who you are, and try to pose your question as a question. But I'm going to ask Nava one more thing while you're thinking of your perfectly honed question. And this is the question you're really going to hate, which is what do we say? What do we say to the people who say, yeah, this is all very well, but actually just a bit more red in tooth and claw capitalism will sort it out. And all boats will float, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
It's an easy question.
Well, no, I mean, I'm thinking about it seriously because, I just came back from Chicago, and we're doing, Marshall and University of Chicago, and LSE and University of Chicago are doing a joint thing, and University of Chicago that is the mantra. So it was absolutely fascinating to be at the home of Milton Friedman and Gary Becker and have this conversation, this exact conversation. And I would say we've tried that. Now let's try something else for a while.
Good answer.
And I think more than anything, there is a refusal of, I think, everyone in this room to live a life that doesn't feel utterly fulfilling and directly connected to the social impact we could have. And so capitalism is being redefined as conscious capitalism all over right now. That feels like the next iteration of this market economy that we're creating.
Great answer. Okay, I've seen one hand. Sir.
Hi, my name is Youre. I'm studying development management here at LSE. So I want to go back to, and thank you very much for this. There's too many things I'd like to ask about, but I'll stick to one. You are talking about how we could help people better. How we could help people better if we understand what they actually want. But, and I know this is paraphrasing, but what kind of venues do you imagine this kind of co-creation of impact? Like, is this social entrepreneurs that are supposed to do it? Is it NGOs that have to change the way that they do programming? Is it other types of interventions? Is it private businesses? What ways are we going to see these thoughts and ideas that you have being implemented, and by whom?
Yeah, I would say all of the above. Private businesses have to do it anyway because they're doing marketing. Essentially, that's like customer research, right? And so to some extent, they're doing that anyway. They're going to fail in the market if they don't really meet the needs of the market, unless there's some kind of other distortion. But
in order to create like a positive social benefits, I'm not interested in just being understanding market for business, but how are we going to create these essential problems, solving these essential problems to poor people through these insights that you have?
I'm saying that basically we have to be on the ground. Whether you're an NGO or a social entrepreneur or a business, you have to be on the ground to understand what the needs of people are and how well your product or your policy or your program is actually going to meet those needs. That's why you need the combination of kind of the best framework. In my life, it's been behavioral economics, but you can think about whatever is the right framework for figuring out those needs, and experimentation and impact evaluation to figure out how well you're doing, to learn how well you're doing. But the problem is that we don't have the incentives to do that because the donors and the foundations are having, that's who the NGOs often will respond to, not to the beneficiary.
Yeah, exactly.
And so that creates a distortion where the incentives are not to be on the ground and really figure out what's needed, but rather to write the right narrative for the foundation or the donors.
And we shouldn't forget some very obvious stuff. It's very hard to create a commercial business if you live completely independently of an understanding of your customers. It's really hard. Okay? I mean, it's just about, I imagine, it's just theoretically possible, but it's hard. And exactly the same is true in this world. Next question. Yes?
Hi, my name is Rani, and I am studying sociological accounting. Kind of as a follow-up to your question, I think just the recent discussion, impact metrics are important. I think we can all agree on that. Current tradition measures service outputs than user outcomes to appease the providers of resources. And providers of resources identified this as a problem as well in meeting the needs of beneficiaries. How do you think we can bridge the gap, though? Because there's this onus on being accountable and transparent, but in being accountable, it's hard to, this is my auditor coming out, it's hard to audit user outcomes because impact is so hard to measure. What are your thoughts on bridging the gap?
Just so that I understand your question, are you saying user satisfaction, like customer satisfaction or patient satisfaction surveys, for example, as a measure, or are you talking about just any user measure?
It's broad. It's
okay. I mean,
yeah.
I don't actually think impact. We have really good technologies for measuring impact. That's actually pretty important that we all understand because it's not like I mean, you can get causal inference, you can get the right measures. It's just a matter of doing it right. So I don't think, I think we have the right way to do it. And we know a lot about impact measurement. I do think that we need to move beyond impact measurement as something that is provided for external donors, and rather something that, for example, is provided back to providers that helps them learn about how to improve their services. As a learning tool, rather than as a way to be necessarily held to a monitoring, so that people can internalize the value they're having.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Frances. I'm a second-year MPA student. Just coming back to that question as well, in terms of linking up, all of this kind of cash that's out there and then actually funneling it towards the organizations that are doing the best job, and how do you get out of this cycle of resource-constrained NGOs, focusing more of their time on actually applying for the grants versus what they're actually supposed to be doing, focusing on the end user. So how do you kind of break the existing cycle and kind of change the way that cash flows?
Yeah. It's a really good question, and lots of people are wrestling with that exact question. And the very short answer to your question is we don't know. But there are lots of people who have very serious ideas. A philanthropic stock market, okay, which would reduce the number of agents and would have daily signaling about the effectiveness from right across the system, is one of the kind of most radical. The least radical is we've got to get beyond the dance that I described a minute ago and start having more sensitive conversations about how we allocate resource. But it's a great question. We don't know. One of the things that the Marshall Institute was founded to think about was exactly these kinds of questions. And we, of course, have to think about them in collaboration with the people wrestling with them in practice, okay, who have data and who have people they're working with whom we have to go work with in order to find out. This side, yes.
Hi, I'm Samira Mehra, a development management alumni, and I now work at Charities Aid Foundation. I'm going to start by disagreeing, just simply because you invited it, and I think this is a great forum. So I think social needs to be very well defined in social entrepreneurship, because Trump is an entrepreneur, and I don't think he's looking to eradicate structural inequality, so to speak. So I think the definition of social becomes really, really important in distinguishing entrepreneurs from social entrepreneurship. I agree that there is... Yes, so I think that was one of my, my starting points. My question is, how do you see, because the way you've talked about philanthropy and social entrepreneurship, it feels like civic activism and the fact that we need more of that. So how do you see the role of philanthropy and social enterprise fitting into realizing, strengthening the value of civil society as a whole? Not, and civil society can play multiple roles. It's providing services that governments may not be able to provide, but it's also maintaining rule of law, making sure there is freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of association. And following on, another question is, do you see, or do you, from your perspective, is there any concern that market-based models, social entrepreneurship, might skew the question towards answering how we can help the poor rather than asking the question why they are poor in the first place?
Okay. So, just to be clear, I think there is a significant difference between social entrepreneurs, and the difference is social intent. Okay? So there's no way that Trump is a social entrepreneur because he doesn't intend to be a social entrepreneur. Because to intend to do so will be to have an explicit sense of the social return on the activity. Okay? As it happens, in brackets, and this is for another session, I think that entrepreneurship is moving in the direction of being social because of a bunch of extrinsic pressures in regulation, in consumer behavior, in social media, in taxation, in, as it were, joined up governance. So corporations are under pressure to recognize the price, the real price of things, and therefore the real benefits and harms. But that's a slightly longer conversation. And I think...
Go ahead.
And I think that we got to also get beyond these binaries. It's either the market or the state. Clearly, these are collaborations and cooperations between lots of actors, okay, including the state.
I do think one thing that you said is I think a danger in a lot of social entrepreneurship and philanthropy too, is that we sort of tinker on the margins, but we don't really understand the structural factors that are causing the inequality and poverty in the first place. And so actually I would just say that's just bad philanthropy or bad social entrepreneurship, and that having the social intent is partly about reading the reality of the environment and mapping out the whole system and understanding where you can make your biggest impact, but recognizing that you're part of a structure, that you're affecting this part, but you need to understand the rest of it too. So we can't give up the understanding of the structural reasons for poverty and inequality.
Have a look at Roger Martin and Sally Osberg's article called The Case for Definition, and it says exactly that. This is about that social entrepreneurship is about identifying systematic equilibrium, okay, that is not, and then shifting it to a better one. Okay, Hans, yes, in the middle.
My name is Joshua. I'm doing my second year urban policy. I have two main questions. First of all, we're talking about understanding, we're talking about data. How do we include qualitative data, such as that produced by anthropologists, sociologists, to the social problems that we're trying to solve? And then at the same time, all of these proper evaluation studies are really costly. In many cases, they can even exceed the price of the intended project that would be resulted from that same study. So how can we achieve doing proper evaluation for every project that we intend if it's so costly? How can we reduce these costs?
So first, I think we have to understand where the costs are coming from, because it's not always costly. So for example, running a randomized trial when you use administrative data. So in a lot of countries, people are collecting health data all the time, education data all the time, and all a randomized trial does is randomize an intervention, right? And then you're just collecting that data anyway. So there's actually no cost there, right? Because the data is already being collected. Usually the cost comes from big household surveys. That's actually where often the cost comes from. And there, like I said, I think the more that you can get regular data that's being collected administratively, the lower the cost is. So often I would just question the assumption that it's more costly. Now the question, the second part of your question, which is how do we incorporate qualitative measures, is a very important one, actually. And I think we can and should use kind of the best of anthropological methods, first in designing interventions, and then in collecting and understanding in pilots of what's happening to the intervention, and sociological. I mean, in lots of my studies, we actually have sociologists who work with us, and we have qualitative data that we then code up, and we use in a quantitative way. So these things can be very complementary.
I don't know if I can do a quick follow-up. How do you
Depends how quick.
How do you do it in developing countries where the state doesn't provide the necessary data? You still need to try to do studies to do your trials. So how can you go into a country where the ministry doesn't have the required data to your project?
You work with the ministry to get the right data. So I've been working in Zambia for the last 14 years. And we've done a lot of work with the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Education to get better and better data, administrative data on health and education. And we use even the opportunities of household surveys that we would get external funding for. That is, by the way, it doesn't have to be from the same plot. So again, the trade-off between activity and evaluation does not have to be a trade-off. You can have other people who fund the research compared to the people who fund the intervention. But the key is to use the research that you're developing, the surveys, the metrics, and work with the government actually to get better metrics, to use that as a process of improving the metrics.
Hi there, my name is Stephan. I'm a master's student here in international political economy. I have an interest in your thoughts on impact, not necessarily impact assessment, but the use of metrics that are universalizable, across a number of different interventions, particularly in terms of large investments in private sector activity. I worked in blended finance previous to coming here, and it was very hard to see how those instruments were comparable, because oftentimes the metrics were so varied, and if you could boil them down, they would often use things like employment that didn't really get at a lot of the more structural things that you're talking about. So how should we be thinking about getting to a better way of looking across all of these interventions that are sometimes not, necessarily easy to do randomized controlled trials, and getting to better outcomes?
We're looking at each other because I think this is we're going to give you a rather medium length version of nobody knows. I think we probably ought to give up on the question, because almost by definition, large complex projects, although they will have things in common, are precisely not universalizable, okay, across a broad enough set of variables. So my guess is, until we know a whole lot more, the answer is stop asking that question. Not you, we. But Nava may have better ideas, as may other people in the room.
Yeah, I guess I would disagree a little bit on that, because I think part of it is just getting better at having the same metrics that we use across a number of projects. And I think there is some alignment now happening as donors start to talk to each other more, as foundations start to talk to each other more, as governments sort of you can kind of agree on a set of metrics. And the more that it's used, is the more you can have comparative cost effectiveness, for example, which is now done in terms of, for example, like what is the best investment for clean water? So the Cochrane Review does that across a number of different studies, and you can have a sense to be able to bring them together. But I think we do have to sort of get better at aligning metrics. Then there's a separate question, which is if something works in one area, can you say that it will work in another area? That's a different question.
But that is your question, isn't it? Part of it. Yeah.
Yeah, but I just want to separate your question into two things, right? One is on the metrics and having the same metrics that you can compare things on, and another is what we understand about an intervention that works in one place and not another. There I would say that, the standard answer that's given there is that we just need to replicate, and every context is different. that's okay and true. But I would say we can go a little bit further in terms of generating knowledge. And if we understand the mechanisms through which a particular change happened, so we need to have better theories of change. When we do understand the theory of change under which something would happen, we can then make the claim of saying, would we think that this mechanism is at play in this other setting? And in some of my own work, I've said, okay, here's the thing you want to measure about, for example, the role of women in the household in managing the budget. That's going to determine who you target the microfinance loan to is going to have whatever impact it's going to have. Now, that's something you can measure across a whole bunch of countries, and that's going to predict the effect of that microfinance loan to one member of the family versus another.
Hi, my name is Maria, and I just have a question about both academia and philanthropy. How do you acknowledge and then deal with a position of power that you're in when working to better understand the needs of communities or grantees?
I love that question. I'm really glad you asked that question.
You answer as a researcher, and I'll try to answer institutionally.
Honestly, as a researcher, I think I'm in a better position than, as long as I don't get absorbed in my own idea that I'm an expert, I am actually in a better position than, say, a consultant, because I don't have to prove my value. I think often when people come in as consultants, they have to, in a short period of time, show the value that they're contributing. Whereas I get to say, let's find out the answer together. And that kind of embarking on a knowledge journey, it allows me to be in a different position, particularly if I don't believe that I have the only tools to answer that question. But I tell you that, in Zambia, I was saying that I worked there. I've worked there for 14 years. When I first started working there, there was a general enormous suspicion against any external, both donors and in particular academics, who had honestly done quite a bad job of coming in and saying they knew what the answer was. And so in order to generate trust, I remember spending hours and hours outside of different people's offices, just showing that I was willing to wait and that my time wasn't more important than theirs. Just something simple like that. Took, days and days and days of that, and sometimes months. But once people saw that I was actually committed, willing to come back, even though I was a Harvard professor, I didn't believe that I had the answer and they didn't, that I deeply respected the knowledge that they had generated, even though they weren't academics. That shifted things radically and allowed a kind of process that would never have been able to happen otherwise.
It's a great question. So we are helped by the fact that if you're in big philanthropy, you care. Okay, so we're working with people who wish to make the world a better place, and as an institution, I think you have to cherish your independence. You have to focus on real knowledge production. Let's call it evidence for the sake of simplicity, and you have to avoid capture. And avoiding capture means you have to avoid looking like the voting arm of a particular intervention. Unless there is a real consensus that particular intervention, whatever it might look like, is beyond any reasonable doubt. So, there are some things that are beyond reasonable doubt, but mostly we need to know a bit more.
We can't become ideological.
Yeah, you have to avoid capture. It's a good question. First you and then you.
My name is Zach, and I'm in the MPA program. So my question is going back to the beginning of talking about being an entrepreneur. And so I answered no, because being an entrepreneur seems scary to me. And maybe part of why we're at LSE is to find answers, or maybe it's because we don't feel like we don't know enough. And so it's kind of a general question of, at what point are you ready to be an entrepreneur. Like entrepreneurs are bold, and we're using these tools to change people's lives in radical ways. And there's, something amazing and something very dangerous about that. And maybe that trade-off.
Again, my answer is I don't know. I suspect some significant time after you've made the move is when you're ready. And I think that you need to resist at all costs the notion that entrepreneurship is this fixed thing where you solo do something that is, global and so on. Entrepreneurship is about getting stuff done without owning or controlling the means to get it done. Social entrepreneurship is about doing exactly that with a very explicit level of intention to create public benefit, okay, or to minimize harm. That happens all over the place, big and small. And we do have a tendency, as it were, to elevate the kind of canonical examples of system-level stuff. And again, we talked about it a minute ago, it is also about identifying, as it were, kind of, bad equilibria. But you can do this stuff locally too, which is why I want always to keep in the frame the notion that anyone can do this, however small. Okay? I would love it if you spent your LSE career trying to figure out how to do it at a more ambitious level with more people, and come talk to us about it. But it is scary. It's supposed to be scary, but it's nowhere near as scary as not doing it.
Stephan, can I, as your colleague, give a slightly different answer?
This is the co-founder of the Marshall Institute, by the way. Yeah. You should all know, and you should vote him. Thanks for having. No. Without him, we wouldn't be in the room.
I'd give just one. I've only got one word answer. Actually, it's yesterday. But I think it's the same answer as Stephan's in a way. I mean, I've met lots of social entrepreneurs who are in their teens, but they're doing it around their home. My wife and I funded last year 150 young people to start new social enterprises below the age of 14. We gave them each £25. And most of them have returned a positive social dividend. And also, I haven't had a single penny back.
Thank you.
That's great.
Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm a first-year PhD in sociology. My question is on the role of markets. So you said that markets are a way to provide a voice to the end user and to beneficiaries. My question is, so we know markets are not perfect and that there's a risk of markets being distorted. So is there a risk of distorting the voices, and are there other ways to understand the end users outside of the market?
Yes, of course. And the most precise way, most concrete way of answering your question is when I say a voice, it's through the mechanism of price. Right? So what happens is that you set a price and people decide whether they're going to buy it or not, and they vote with their dollars. And so through people's willingness to pay for something, you see whether they really want it or not, and whether you're providing a desired good. But if their willingness to pay is confounded with their ability to pay, then price isn't a great mechanism for figuring out what people might need the most. Yeah. Does that make sense? So in that case, yes, we absolutely need other mechanisms.
Okay, we have questions queuing up, so I'm going to ask you to ask your question. Then I'm going to pick up all the questions in the room. You can get all the questions on the table. Then we'll try and mash them together and answer, because we're down to our last 4 minutes.
Okay, my name is Agostina, and I'm a first-year MPA of the MPA program. My question is with regard with the time constraint, because I know it's good evaluating, designing a correct implementation of a policy, but sometimes you don't have that time. Sometimes it's better just doing the action rather than taking that time in planning. So how you can solve this trade-off between timing and planning and making a really good intervention with something that is struggling?
Do you know about lean Do you know about this? Lean startup, lean social startup? Do you know what I mean when I say that? Does anyone know what I mean when I say lean? No, okay. There is a methodology in entrepreneurial thinking which is called the lean startup methodology, and it addresses exactly the question you described. Because if we'd been having this conversation a decade ago, all the conversation would have been about planning. Okay? You need a plan, the plan has to be 40 pages, it has to have lots and lots and lots of variable assumptions and so on. And everybody got good at planning, okay? And nobody got very good at starting stuff. The current orthodoxy is entirely the opposite to address exactly your question. It's called the lean startup methodology. It's premised on something called the minimum viable prototype or the minimum viable product. So build something as cheaply as you can and force it to fail as quickly as you can. If you can't force it to fail, you're onto something. If you can force it to fail, build something else that's even cheaper and make that one fail, and so on and so on. Okay. Right, we are coming to the very last furlong. So what I'm going to suggest is those people who I've spotted have questions. Can you register your question? I will try and keep track of them, and then I will ask Nava to answer them in perfectly formed sentences.
Regarding big philanthropic organization, they usually focus their resources on different projects, causing like small impact in each project. I was wondering, why don't they choose like a certain problem and dedicate the resources for this problem to eradicate it? And maybe that would cause like further marketing propaganda for them. Or
Let's just get all the questions.
Okay,
ready.
there's a question up right at the top there.
Hi, I'm Dana, and I'm a first-year PhD student in management. And the thing I've been hearing a lot at work is around partnerships, especially at the implementing level, and how one entity would specialize in one area and another in another area. Obviously, if you join forces, hopefully together you can do more good than if not together. So I guess my question here is, just hearing about bringing out the voice of the end user customer, does that voice often get lost, or are there certain challenges that we should be aware of when we're doing localized partnerships?
Got it, thank you. Yes, there, and then there was, I saw a couple more hands, yeah, there. And up there, those three. 1, 2, 3.
My name's Evan. I'm taking health, population, and society. But an issue that I ran into in my last life was in politics, and it was that we would try and make decisions based on evidence or decisions that would measure impact. And you can run into a lot of people who just outright refuse to acknowledge that. Their emotions often trump evidence. And they can be very disruptive and really sideline any project that you're working on. So how do you overcome those sorts of challenges of emotion versus evidence?
Got it.
That's a good.
Hi, my name is Alejandra. I'm from the Development Management Masters. I wanted to ask, you were saying that to get better knowledge, we need to be on the field, like in a very local context, getting to know what is really happening where we are making an intervention. But at the same time, everything is about scaling things up. So how can we match these two things?
Got it. Good one.
I'm returning to data. So how do you make sure that the data that you have is quite precise, especially in terms, for example, on developing countries where simply the data might not be really precise enough, especially on like the worst off parts of the country where people are maybe less enlightened and less educated, and they don't really answer the surveys, so then maybe they don't understand the survey, for example. So could you elaborate on methods that you could use to get like a more precise data of what they really need?
Okay, so we have a set of questions. We have a question about scale and whether endless talk about scale is in contradiction to endless talk about local, customized, specific. That's one question. We have a question about how you ensure the quality of data. We have the first use of the word Trump this evening. And that's a question about what do you do when despite what we know, people persist in responding to evidence, not responding to evidence. And we have a question about why interventions are not more focused, why people are trying to do various things rather than one.
And we have a question about localized partnership and when the voice.
And we have a question about partnership.
Let me try to take all of them. This is the challenge that Stephan put towards me. Okay, so I start with the emotion trumping evidence. I think that the very same thing that causes us to think, how come, I don't understand, why aren't they taking their kids to get vaccinated when that's actually so important, is the same thing that we might think why aren't policymakers using evidence? Because actually they weren't involved in the production of the evidence. So I think it's actually quite not realistic of us to say that everyone should be evidence-based decision makers, when in fact that evidence, exactly as you said, is actually being processed through a lens of emotion. So I think what we need to do to overcome that is to have a model of co-generating evidence together with policymakers. When we co-generate knowledge together with policymakers, they feel that it's their data. It's not coming from outside of them. It's their data, and then that actually solves this other problem. Then they become very vested in having, to your question up there about the quality of data, they become very vested in getting the right quality of data. Again, it's their data. And so everyone becomes very invested in figuring out how to improve the quality of data. And let me just say, there is a lot of innovation. You can take lots of courses here at LSE on how you can get better quality data from developing countries. So there's a lot out there of knowledge on that front. And so that's on the precise data. And that's also where I would say in terms of localized partnership and when the voice of the end user can get lost, that again, with this co-generation of knowledge, one challenge is actually, so imagine you have policymakers and academics co-generating knowledge together. But then, of course, the academics and the policymakers need to be sufficiently on the ground to be getting the voice of the end user. So I agree that that's actually a danger, that you could lose that other side. But it's something that can be overcome partly through iteration. And that, I think, gets to kind of the localized partnerships, the localized, intervention, the customized intervention versus scale. To that, I would answer, why would you want to scale something that doesn't work? So you want to first design it properly. But because actually what you need to think about is, what's the opportunity cost of you scaling something that doesn't work and that wasn't actually designed well to begin with? This process of lean iteration, failing quickly, can be implemented in the field pretty easily. You can quickly figure out something that isn't working or isn't working. Doesn't have to take a huge amount of time. And then you can think from there how to scale it. But in particular, if it's generated together with the policymakers, together with the kinds of organizations that would scale it, the scale part of the process is embedded in the first stages of piloting. So already as you're piloting, you're doing it together with the people that, if you get the right evidence, they're already the ones that would scale. And so you get to scale really quickly by getting the right intervention. Okay. And that's, to that last question, I guess, which is about, coordination. That's, we have a lot of miscoordination in this sector, for sure. And again, I would say that if, through the coordinating bodies of governments, for example, you could coordinate among a number of NGOs and other people who are generating knowledge. And when, again, knowledge and action and policy are part of the same iterative process, it is easier to overcome inefficiencies that come from duplication of efforts or not choosing big enough foci and just making change on the margin.
And it's one of the great differences between private, purely commercial activity and social activity is that there's no imperative to capture a market and exclude other players. So one of the great things about social entrepreneurship is you don't have to exclude your competitors. Okay? It's one of the structural advantages. We have come to the end of our session, plus 3 minutes, for which I apologize. I would like to thank, first of all, you for great questions and for being here. I think these questions will be shaped through the rest of the lecture series. I'd like to thank Nava for answering your questions so coherently. I'd like to thank my colleagues for helping me prepare this and organize this evening. And I look forward to welcoming you back in a couple of weeks, in 1 week's time. And I would like to invite you all to join us for a drink in the atrium, where I hope these conversations will continue. I leave you with just 3 things that Nava said that I suspect will recur during the course of the series. She said, be on the ground. Okay? Be on the ground. She said, we're all conscious capitalists now. So maybe we're beyond it's either shareholders or it's society. And she said, be humble enough to co-create. Don't figure something out and then hope that people will spontaneously change the way they behave as a result of your genius. I'll leave you with those 3 things because I suspect they will recur. Thank you very much.